Good morning. I'm Gregory Allen, the director of the Wadhwani Center for AI and Advanced Technologies here at CSIS. This week marks the one-year anniversary of the October 7th export controls on AI and semiconductor technology that the Biden administration enacted upon China. That policy was a landmark in the history of U.S. and China relations. And while the target of that policy was China's military AI development, the means to that end was international semiconductor value chains. And so the policy also marks a landmark in the history of the semiconductor industry worldwide. This has been a frequent topic of conversation here in Washington, D.C., but too often the policy conversation suffers from a shortage of international perspectives, especially among U.S. allies who have leading roles in the international semiconductor ecosystem. The CSIS Wadhwani Center has published a new report titled The Post-October 7th World: International Perspectives on Semiconductors and Geopolitics, which is now available on csis.org. And this report, we hope, will partially address this shortage of international perspectives. It is a compendium of essays from leading experts on semiconductors and international relations from many U.S. allies, each of whom play a critical role in the global semiconductor industry, including regions and countries such as the European Union, Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, Germany, and the United States. By bringing together scholars from these different regions, countries, and so on, we hope to help improve the quality of the Washington debate by bringing in allied perspectives. And our event today was originally going to be a two-part event. We were going to have a discussion with a senior director from the White House National Security Council who was part of the momentum behind this policy, but he had a conflicting appointment, and so we're going to have to reschedule that event. But I'm delighted to say that the second part of our event will go forward, and that's a discussion with many of the authors of the essays in this new compendium. That discussion is going to be moderated by my CSIS colleague, Emily Benson, and I'll turn it over to her now. Over to you, Emily.
Thank you to Greg for that insightful conversation. We turn now to the authors of our new compendium on export controls, the title of which is International Perspectives on Semiconductors and Geopolitics in a Post-October 7th, 2022 World. As we approach the one-year mark following the October 7th export controls, we thought it would be useful to collect key takeaways from observers in Korea, Germany, Japan, the Netherlands, Taiwan, the United States, and European Union. A representative of each has contributed to a chapter in this compendium. For the sake of time, I will skip each of their illustrious bios, which you can read in the compendium. Instead, I will provide their short titles. So today from Korea, we have Won-ho Yeon. He is a research fellow and the head of the economic security team at the Korea Institute for International Economic Policy. Jan-Peter Kleinhans from Germany is a director of technology and geopolitics at S&V in Berlin. Bram Korteweg joins us from The Hague in the Netherlands, where he is a senior research fellow at Klingendale. Chao Chun Jack is currently a senior strategy executive director at the Industrial Technology Research Institute in Taiwan. And Francesca Giretti joins us on behalf of the European Union. She is an analyst at the Mercator Institute for China Studies. So thank you again to our guests for joining us today. What struck me about each chapter is the similarity of themes across borders. These include that geopolitics have deeply penetrated trade and economics, and that this new era of de-risking is here to stay. Furthermore, a technology-dominated economic security agenda will need to be carried out in very close coordination with allies if it will succeed. In other words, export controls are part of a much larger strategic trade toolkit, which we're witnessing evolve in real time and across jurisdictions. Another key theme from the chapters, sometimes direct, other times implicit, is that the underlying questions are very pervasive about the suitability of the 20th century institutions to confront today's challenges. So we will begin today's conversation with each author providing a brief overview of their chapter. We then will move on to a more targeted discussion. We'll have a couple of very specific compendium questions for each panelist. And as a reminder to our listeners, you can find the compendium on the CSIS website. So thank you again to our distinguished panelists for being here. And Wanho, let's begin with you.
Yes, hi. It is really a pleasure to work with Emily and Greg. So let me briefly talk about my paper. So given that China, including Hong Kong, accounts for 60% of South Korea's semiconductor exports each year, and Samsung and SK Hynix produce almost half of their chips in China, October 7th regulations directly impact on the South Korean economy. South Korean companies received a year reprieve last year, but how long South Korean companies can continue to operate semiconductor factories in China depends on how long they are able to get a reprieve from the October 7th regulations. In general, based on my interviews with policymakers and industry, South Korea holds a supportive stance regarding the U.S. approach to China's semiconductor industry. Semiconductor technology lies at the core of advanced and emerging technologies that can be converted to military use. Therefore, South Korea aligns itself with the U.S. efforts to restrict the transfer of advanced semiconductor technology to countries of concern. South Korea and the United States share the same policy goals. In the context of China in particular, it is widening the technology gap to the point where China cannot substitute imports with indigenous semiconductor chips. However, in the case of the semiconductor industry, where a clear division of rules exists, countries' detailed economic security interests are bound to differ. The U.S. with its strength in design and equipment, South Korea with its strength in manufacturing, are bound to have different perspectives on semiconductor risk management. The widening of the technological gap can be accomplished simultaneously in two directions. First, by locking down Chinese capabilities, and second, by developing advanced technology. South Korea thinks that the U.S. too much focuses on export controls to close China's semiconductor production capacity rather than figuring out how to capitalize on the Chinese market, which is the world's largest consumer of semiconductor chips. We must think about why the semiconductor industry has become oligopolized. This phenomenon happened not only in the manufacturing industry, but also in equipment industry, components and materials industry. The answer is quite simple. The recent technological development requires an astronomical investment of money, and few companies can raise such funds. In other words, when seeking to widen the technology gap to guarantee a country's advantage, securing a stable flow of funds is as crucial as preventing technology leakage. South Korea thinks the core of the U.S. and South Korean strategy should be to widen the technology gap through a combination of export controls and utilization of the Chinese market. Let me stop here.
Thank you very much. JP, let's go to you next for the German perspective.
Thanks, Emily. Maybe as a first, I wrote my chapter together with Julian Ringhoff from ECFR, from the European Council of Foreign Relations, where at the time of writing was a policy fellow. And in contrast maybe to Korea's perception and also in contrast, for example, to the Netherlands, there was very little direct impact of the October controls on German companies, both in terms of German semiconductor suppliers, but especially on German equipment suppliers, German chemical suppliers. But the controls came at a time when Germany, I would say, was more geopolitically aware. We had the now infamous Zeitenwende speech from Olaf Scholz. We had Germany's realization of the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine, questioning dependence in general. We had the release of the China strategy, Germany's China strategy. We had the release of Germany's national security strategy. So it came at a time when Germany was already questioning, let's say in broader terms, dependence on foreign technology suppliers, and more broadly, how to deal with China, let's say in the broadest sense, but especially also in terms of future technology transfers. That said, I think it is interesting if you compare it on the policy level, on the discourse level, if you compare the impact of the October controls and what happened during the release of the Inflation Reduction Act, two very different debates. The latter started a very broad, very public, very political debate about US protectionism, the impact of on Germany's car manufacturers, what should Germany do and Europe do as a response, engagement. We had hearings in the parliament. We had basically all the large industry associations writing white papers about the impact of the IRA and similar things. Now, fast forward to the October controls, none of that happened with the October controls. There was no public hearing in the parliament. You don't really find white papers or position papers from industry associations, which already shows you that the impact is limited simply because the technologies that the October controls are focusing on are in general not supplied by German companies, but B, that, let's say, semiconductors from a geopolitical lens have not really reached, I would say, the German government yet. Of course, there is a very vibrant discussion about how to update and how to change the export control regulation in Germany and in Europe, and very lively debates about to what extent to include economic security into this. But I would say at the time when the October controls were released, all of this were just at its infancy and not at a point where Germany had the capability to quickly come up with a 10 bullet point plan that would follow up with US October controls.
Thank you, JP. Rem, let's go to you next. JP just painted a picture of a relatively light touch with the German government. I think it's safe to say the opposite has been true with the Dutch government, who are part of this trilateral arrangement, if we can call it that, between the US, Japan, and the Netherlands. So let's turn to you for Dutch perspectives.
Yeah, thank you so much, Emily, and thank you so much for reaching out to invite me to draft this chapter, which has been an absolute pleasure. So you're completely right that the Netherlands has had a bit of a different debate regarding the October 7 export controls than in Germany. Let me first of all say, for the uninitiated, the Netherlands plays an outsized role in the global semiconductor ecosystem, primarily because of the dominant position of particularly one company, ASML, in the field of semiconductor manufacturing machinery. And ASML's role, I think, pervades my chapter because it sits at the apex of the Dutch semiconductor system, but also globally is a leading edge technology provider for the semiconductors that lead to either advances in artificial intelligence or next generation computing. So the Dutch debate was very much about ASML. ASML was exposed to the October 7 regulations because ASML incorporates US technology, they employ US employees, and they have US subsidiaries, so they were affected. Now, the story after October 7 has been that the Netherlands has been playing catch up with the United States in terms of developing its own export licensing requirements and toughening those. And the US measures really acted as a catalyst for the Netherlands to up its game, to introduce export licensing requirements of its own, and also to think through what the implications are of allowing some of this high-end technology to proliferate to particularly China. And the discussion regarding October 7 didn't start last year. Actually, it fits within a broader conversation that the United States and the Netherlands have been having about the export of advanced lithography machines probably since 2018. And what you find is that that conversation with the United States, where the United States was pushing the Netherlands to initially prevent the export of ASML's most advanced lithography machines, EUV technology, coincided with a period where the Netherlands was becoming increasingly critical of its ties with China. That first was related to concerns about human rights violations in China, and secondly, also in the context of the global pandemic, about China's opportunity to use economic coercion or to use economic dependencies in the Netherlands to pursue certain foreign policy goals, or simply security and spying and sabotage connected to reliance on Chinese tech. And last but not least, most recently, concerns that about China's technological edge. And so in that context, where the Netherlands was growing increasingly concerned about where China was moving towards, the United States and the Netherlands upped their conversation about export licensing requirements and stopping some of the most advanced lithography machines from being exported to China. Now, the Netherlands very clearly followed US indications when it came to stopping the export of EUV machines. It took a little bit longer before somewhat less advanced, but still very advanced DUV immersion lithography machines were put under export controls. And some of that had to do with concerns that the United States might have been pursuing industrial policy aims of its own. And it led to a certain lag, I would say, in the Dutch response. In any case, what happened over the past couple of years has been a very intensive shuttle diplomacy between the United States and Europe, or the United States and the Netherlands, of course. The Netherlands has a strong transatlantic reflex, was always going to lean towards Washington, but has had to walk a fine line between following the US lead and at the same time avoiding severing its economic ties with China. But, and let me stop here, the justification that has been given to the new set of Dutch export licensing requirements, that justification is very broad. It's based on public security grounds, and it basically opens the route to new, extra, additional, or even toughened export guidelines. Why? Because it says that uncontrolled export of these technologies could have, quote, significant implications for the public security interests of the Netherlands, but also of its allies. In other words, if the United States keeps making the case that certain technological proliferation is against US national security interests, they might find a listening ear in The Hague. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rem. I think the comparison between Germany and the Netherlands demonstrates just how varied the effects of the controls and the ensuing policy responses can be, even inside the European Union. But next we turn to Jack from Taiwan, which unsurprisingly has had a very different experience, not only following the application of these controls, but also following the Chips and Science Act that was passed last August here in the United States. Jack, over to you.
Yes, I think first I'd like to thank you, Emily, for inviting me to join the webinar. So I think Taiwan has a very similar situation, just like for Dutch, but we are in a different perspective. First, I think Taiwan has a very close trade relationship with China. It accounts about 40% of our total export. But on the semiconductor side, it's account for maybe more than 60%, according to the statistics for 2022. So I think for Taiwan, I think, especially for the semiconductor industry, I think we have a very close tie with the Chinese market. And also, I think Taiwan itself, we have developed a very strong semiconductor ecosystem in Taiwan. As all of you know, for Dutch, maybe it's ASML, but in Taiwan, it's TSMC. I think it's on the epicenter of almost all those discussions. Okay? And I think for the new statistics, I think TSMC accounts for maybe 50% of the global fab service capabilities. But more importantly, it's come for more than 90% of more advanced node. That means lower than 7 nanometer. And I think for the October 7th, I think we do not see a comprehensive impact or any announcement from either the government or from the industrial side. Especially for TSMC, they never comment on a single customer related issues. But we can find out that for Taiwan government, we did not issue any new export control measures follow the announcement for BIS on October 7th. The reason for that is Taiwan already established a we call it high-tech commodity import-export management system since 1995. So it's closely aligned with the various international control regime, such as the Watson arrangement you have been mentioned. So we don't see any new things happen on that side. But on the other hand, as I mentioned, we have a very close trade or economic relation with China. So since we speak same language, so Taiwan is a nature or is a primary target, okay, for China, try to require technology, especially in the semiconductor sector, because we are more advanced than them. Also, they try to poach talent from Taiwan. So for the government, I think since 2022, we have initiated new laws and regulation. For example, we have amended our National Security Act. Okay, so we say that in that amendment, we say that is the revised law incorporate protections for trade secrets related to national core critical technology, aiming to deter malicious talent poaching and unauthorized outflow of key core technology, such as to competitors such as China. Furthermore, the government also amended the Cross Trade Relation Act, which was also on June 2022. They adding a provision that individuals, corporations, groups, or other institutional members engage in national core critical technology business under the commission, subsidy, or investment of government agency or organizations must obtain approval through a review process coordinated by various government agencies before they can go to China. And the same rule also applies to those who have terminated their commission, subsidy, or investment, or have resigned within 3 years. So I think from the government side, we believe that the above mentioned laws and regulations demonstrate Taiwan government's will and determination to prevent unauthorized outflow of key core technology and related personnel. So I think is maybe we don't have any new export control schemes being promulgated after the October 7th, but I think it's for us to deal with China's pressure. I think it's a constant thing. Okay, for us, it's not anything new. So we just try to abide by the international norm and try our best to work with our allies and partners.
Well, thank you all for those perspectives. Francesca, over to you for the European Union, European Commission perspective.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you so much for having me here today and for letting me represent the European Union, which is a huge responsibility. So the October 7th export control came in 2022, and in 2021, the European Commission had just updated their export control regulations to include dual-use export controls. And that is still the basis in terms of regulations that we're using nowadays. And in that regulation, basically the member states give the European Commission the mandate to expand the list of items that are included within the regulation under the limits, in theory, we can discuss a little bit more about this later, in theory of harmonizing these with the international agreements. And the problem that three problems mainly emerge from the October 7th regulation. The first one is the fear or the concern that it is a containment measure rather than a measure to protect national security or public order, which remains the basis of many export control regulations within the European Union. The second is that it may have extraterritorial implications, and this is a recurrent theme when it comes to US policies. The European Union, one of the first sort of alarm bells has to do with, does it have extraterritorial implications for us? And the third one is, and I guess there was also this was a fair concern, that single member states would be handpicked and separated from the bloc and would have larger implications than others. And again, looking at the story of the Netherlands, maybe handpicked is not the happiest term, apologies, but looking at the background of the Netherlands, that was in part a concern that had a basis. And then on top of all of that, the signal after October 7th was also that this proposal from the United States may come to include much more technologies than the ones that just were proposed in October. And so the concern was that also the number of member states that would have had to respond somehow, or that would have had been subjected to some form of extraterritorial implications could grow. At the same time, in the same sort of time frame, a little bit later, the European Union was working on its economic security strategy. So it was already mentioned that then economic security comes to play a role, and the debate between how much these policies should cover economic security on top of what is economic security, and how much they should cover national security and public order started. Now we're seeing a lot is happening within the European Union, with more member states thinking about whether they want to expand export controls themselves. But we're also, and this is sort of the bottom-up approach, but we're also seeing things happening at the top-down approach, with the European Commission itself adopting, for example, a list of critical technologies on the basis of which it may or may not propose to expand the export control, the list of the items of the export control regulation. And I think this is more or less sort of the overview of what happened in the EU after October 7th.
Francesca, I'm glad that you mentioned economic security. That's my first question for Wan Ho, relates exactly to that. You write in your chapter that advanced technology controls are basically inextricably linked with economic security objectives. My question for you is whether there might be some utility in either the US controls or an equivalent instrument, because it seems like from afar that the Republic of Korea also wants to delay Chinese technological capabilities. Could you comment on that? You might be muted, Wan Ho.
Yeah. So we believe that recent U.S. actions have been taken for national security purposes, not economic ones. For example, CHIPS Act subsidy of $52.7 billion over 5 years is quite small considering the nature of the semiconductor industry. Samsung alone has invested $100 billion over the past 3 years. And there's no economic reason to impose export controls on China, which is the largest consumer of semiconductors at the moment, and consumes almost 60% of chips produced every year. But interestingly, the U.S. measures actually help South Korean companies these days. In the short term, South Korean industry and policymakers, we believe that the U.S. export controls will delay the rise of Chinese semiconductor capabilities. For example, there are many papers saying that South Korea would have already been overtaken by China in the NAND memory sector without the recent U.S. export controls against China. However, South Korea also believes that if the current situation continues, companies will suffer greatly in the long term. Thank you.
JP, let's turn back to Germany for a minute. And you note that the response in Germany, not only from the government, but also the think tank Blob and stakeholders in general, has been a little bit tepid, maybe slightly apathetic, because they have not been directly affected, which makes sense. But I'm wondering if Germany, by not having a seat at the proverbial table, risks losing some degree of geopolitical leverage. Should it be a greater part of this conversation?
To be honest, I'm curious myself. I mean, on the one hand, I think that Germany has to make up its mind how and to what extent export controls will be used more extensively for economic security purposes. Whether this will happen within the Wassenaar arrangement, which I don't think there's an appetite within the German government to do that, or to use a different tool, to establish a different tool with like-minded allies to do something like that. I think here the German government has to make up its mind, but it has not yet. On the other hand, I also think that there is a little bit similar to what Wan Ho said. I think there is also the increasing recognition among German politicians that it is not just purely national security considerations that are driving, or at least national security considerations in the understanding of Germany that are driving the US controls, but that they are closely linked with economic security and also to some extent with industrial policy. And that, of course, creates hesitation on the German side to fully align, simply because I think there is not a shared vision regarding the long-term engagement with China between the US and Germany. I think what is lacking is, just like I would say the US government with October controls defined its own red line in terms of long-term technology transfer, at least in semiconductors, toward China. And so far, I would say the German government has not made its own red line, has not defined its own red line, because it would be linked to a long-term vision regarding technology transfer and long-term cooperation or containment of China.
Ram, let's go back to the Netherlands for a minute. Your compendium chapter is full of these amazing statistics about the power of the chips industry in the Netherlands. For example, that it accounts for about a quarter of the value of the Amsterdam Stock Exchange. It's really powerful. But at the same time, your chapter discusses indigenization quite a bit. The idea that the Chinese will try to de-risk from foreign suppliers and scale up the ability to substitute ASML tools, for example. You say that this would risk becoming a quote unquote national Chinese obsession, and that this is something we should really be worried about. So what can the United States, the Netherlands, and other foreign partners do to minimize the risks of an accelerated pursuit of indigenous capabilities in China?
Yeah, thanks very much, Emily. I think it's a great question. I think it's one of the big dilemmas we currently face when it comes to the technology competition between, say, the West and China. And just another statistic to throw out as context is that, according to the Dutch Association of High-Tech Industry, 85% of all semiconductors used worldwide are made on machines manufactured in the Netherlands. And that sort of puts the Netherlands in a unique position, but I also think it gives it a unique responsibility to respond to what I think really is this challenge of growing Chinese indigenization, because indigenous Chinese lithography innovation is, I think, inevitable. And this is simply the result of the October 7 guidelines. I think the October 7 guidelines basically told the Chinese, look, you're going to have to develop high-end semiconductors by yourself. And we are where we are. I don't necessarily have views on whether this is good or bad, but we are where we are. And so how do you maintain that technological leadership? And I would identify 3 steps. I mean, first of all, we, say the West, currently have an edge, and so we have to maintain that edge. And that means that we need to develop a technology strategy to maintain an edge in, say, advanced lithography or next generation semiconductor manufacturing, whether that's quantum or photonics or what have you. And sure, in a Dutch context, that makes it very relevant for the Netherlands to emphasize its role in how the government can support that industry from continuing. And the Netherlands needs to build up its own sort of economic intelligence capacity to be able to understand what the Chinese are doing and what the Americans are doing and others. But it's not just a Dutch responsibility. It's also very much a European responsibility. Actually, you could argue that this strategy to maintain that edge is going to fail unless it is embedded in a European strategy. And I listened to Jan Peter and sort of what he says about Germany not being affected. And it worries me a little bit because sure, we can say that ASML is a Dutch company, but not really. If you look at the supply chains feeding into ASML, I mean, they are very international. They're also very European, and they're also very German. And so we need to have a broader sense of urgency that this is not just a Dutch challenge or a Dutch-US challenge. This is very much a European challenge as well. And so I think in that context, we need to have a conversation also about what this means for outbound investment controls. I mean, that's sort of where the next step is in terms of the development of a European economic security strategy, but that has a very strong transatlantic dimension as well. So that's my second point. I mean, I think we would need much closer transatlantic coordination. Transatlantic being shorthand for G7, because you cannot do this without the Japanese, without also the Republic of Korea or even Taiwan. And that raises questions because we're not just talking about one company. There are a number of competitors there as well. So how do you enable competition while sustaining coordination? And that's a challenge. And my third point, which is we also need to keep our eyes on what the Chinese are doing. We can't sever all our ties with China. It's not just about building up economic intelligence. It's also about keeping channels open to some degree, because to be honest, the risk of October 7 is that we're going to be kept in the dark about what indigenous Chinese innovation means. And it's better to know what is going on in China than to be surprised by it.
Well, thank you. Just a personal advertisement. I have a paper coming out in a few weeks that recommends expanding the G7 to include the Republic of Korea, among others, to move forward jointly on economic security issues, of which major pillars are industrial cooperation on chips and also export controls and investment screening. So stay tuned for that. But Jack, let's go over to you to discuss more of this promote side of this dual pillar. We have protect and promote. You write in your compendium that the U.S. pursuit of industrial chips policy has sparked a fierce debate in Taiwan about whether this could hollow out Taiwan or whether moving some production offshore simply represents a global expansion by Taiwan. You also argue at the same time that maintaining a robust bilateral chips trade with China can create geopolitical leverage that allies ought to maintain. So is there a way that partner countries can both safeguard security, safeguard the interests of Taiwan, and also maintain chip flows with China?
Okay, I think for the current situation cross trade, I think it's pretty tense. Okay, we can see China military ships and airplanes circle around Taiwan all the time, and the frequency is much higher than they used to be. Okay. So I think for us, I think we need to find a balance between our national security and our economic development, because Taiwan is heavily dependent on export, okay, to sustain our economic growth. So from the past, I think a few years, I think from the protect side, I think first I think the Biden administration has imposing a measure, okay, to delay China's development in advanced semiconductor capabilities. So which is a part of strategy to precise decoupling or de-risk toward China, but avoid a total decoupling. So in other words, I think the US is trying to find a balance between national security and economic development by imposing technology containment to China, so to protect the core American interests. But currently, I think the US and its Chip 4 partners, which including USA, Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan, okay, we have the edge, okay, in innovation and production of advanced node semiconductors. So whether the US and its allies can hold on to its semiconductor supremacy, I think it really depends on the success of all those industrial policy and how quickly China succeed in domestic industrial indigenization. So I think China has issued a new strategy called China Standard 2035. They try to develop a set of their own standard. I think not only in semiconductor, but also maybe in AI or in other related high-tech industries. So I think also I think in nowadays I think on the news is the new smartphone, the 60s, okay, from Huawei. They all think about for their new chip, Chili 9000S. Okay, it's something like a 7-nanometer chip. So they don't say it's a 5G, but I think it's 5G compatible. We see a lot of report on that. So definitely, I think China is trying to use so-called the whole nation approach, try to develop their own technology and standard. So nowadays, I think there's a delicate balance, okay, as all the panelists that we mentioned, we try to find a delicate balance between the national security and the economic interest or economic security. And from the other perspective, I think from the promote aspect, I think the COVID pandemic has triggered a global chip shortage, okay, which prompted countries around the world to promulgate incentive policy, such as the US Chips and Science Act, to enhance the resilience of its own supply chain by attracting investment in semiconductor manufacturing capabilities. As I mentioned, I think TSMC is the primary target, okay, for various countries try to invite TSMC to set up new wafer fab in their countries. TSMC already announced plans to establish, I think, 2 fabs in Arizona of United States, and they already almost finished one in Kumamoto of Japan. And also they just announced, I think in August, that they will build a similar one in Dresden of Germany. So which is taking a global perspective for TSMC on its investment project. However, I think the US containment has prompted Chinese companies to shift their focus toward more mature process capability development. We see from the news that Chinese has invested a lot on so-called mature process capabilities. I think in the coming years, it will significantly increase. And I think all the fab service provider who is on the similar technology level with those Chinese fab, I think they will face, I say, furious, I think, price cutting competition from Chinese manufacturer. Okay, so I think for all the other, okay, non-China semiconductor companies, I think we should think about, could we develop product that can be differentiated from the Chinese companies to avoid price competition and to keep or increase their market share in the Chinese market. So I think it's a challenge not only for Taiwanese company, but I think it's also for example, for Korean companies, for Japanese company, as well as for those major automobile chips suppliers in Europe. So I think it's a general concern, I think, among different countries, and how are we going to strike a balance, okay, between our own development and also not hindered by the Chinese development. I think it's an issue I think we need to consider more delicately, I think, in the coming weeks or even in the coming years.
Francesca, earlier you said that extraterritoriality can set off alarm bells in Brussels. And my question for you is about whether or not the application of extraterritorial export controls in the October 7th context is really unique, or whether it fits into a broader narrative. If you've read several recent books, one by Agatha Desmarais on how sanctions policies can backfire, a new one from Abe Newman and Henry Farrell on trade weaponization, they cite a couple of fairly prominent cases ranging from the Huawei controls to the JCPOA negotiations, an American decision to pull out, de-SWIFTing. So is October 7th really unique, or is this part of a longer term strategic trade toolkit?
You know this better than I do, but no, it's definitely not unique. And this is definitely not an isolated complaint from the European Union regarding US extraterritoriality. There's also seemed to be a bit of gap between what the EU views and European countries view as being extraterritorial measures and what the US views as being extraterritorial measures. And even if we look a little bit forward, and outbound investment screening regulations have already been mentioned. Every time we talk about this, I get sort of shivers. So we've been mentioning this thing for such a long time that, you know. But even if we look at the proposal that was made, you know, there may be some extraterritorial implications in that as well. So it's definitely a trend. It's something that the US does. And to be completely frank, and here, of course, I'm not representing the view of the European Union, but to be completely frank, is reasonable. It's one of the strongest means that the US has, not only of implementing properly and in an efficient way some of the policies, but also in sort of nudging, to be diplomatic, other countries to follow suit. So from the European Union perspective, this is indeed annoying, especially if it comes without prior coordination, which often is not the case, but sometimes it is. But from a US perspective, I do understand why this is so effective, especially at the times when international agreements are not as effective as they used to be.
All right, well, let me ask each of you one final question as we have hit the 15-minute mark on our remaining time. And this is about the Wassenaar arrangement, the multilateral export control system that we have today. It's confronted with a set of pretty substantial problems. Russia is a membership, it's consensus-based, therefore Russia has veto-like authority. It's also very slow, very bureaucratic, its processes are quite opaque. But it is a multilateral forum for promulgating export controls. And so I'm wondering what each of you sees as the future of the Wassenaar arrangement, and if you think that the time is upon us to consider something new, whether that's a series of minilateral regimes that are sectoral in nature, one large replacement, if we should maintain Wassenaar as is. So I'm curious to hear each of your countries' perspectives on what I think will be sort of the next big issue area when it comes to international export control policy. So Won-ho, let's start with you from the Korean perspective.
Yes, the Wassenaar arrangement has limitations, as just you mentioned, like limited scope of control, inefficient decision-making structure, lack of licensee policy coordination mechanism, and lack of public, like private partnerships. So South Korea also thinks about we should have a kind of new mechanism to deal with these issues. I think we can come up with a framework that does not replace Wassenaar arrangement, but complements it by sector. For example, the semiconductor sector, Fab 4 is already there between Korea, US, Japan, and Taiwan. Also, equipment export control cooperation between US, Netherlands, and Japan. So these kind of frameworks could be linked and form a new kind of initial framework for discussing the semiconductor export controls. But whatever the framework, South Korea should be included as a key stakeholder in the semiconductor supply chain. South Korea should participate in export control discussions from the outset. South Korea needs to reduce uncertainty by making and implementing decisions together with its key partners, protecting not only South Korea's own technology, but also that of its partners. Thank you.
JP, where do the Germans stand?
Well, with a disclaimer that it's of course I cannot speak for the German perspective, and I'm not an expert regarding the, let's say, governance and future of Wassenaar. But I would say it's a fair assessment to say that not just within the German government, but also within a couple of European member states, there's this strong conviction that the fact that Wassenaar does not just consist of like-minded countries, and that Wassenaar is consensus-based, and that Wassenaar is first and foremost, let's say, deeply rooted in national security, as in hard national security and, let's say, world peace, let's make the world a safer place consideration, that these are all benefits, that these are all assets of Wassenaar that need to be protected. That's at least what kind of I heard a lot in our discussions with different stakeholders. So I could, maybe similar to what one host said, I could imagine that we see maybe minilateral or plurilateral forums next to Wassenaar that deals decidedly with economic security, technology transfer. I kind of cannot imagine that the German government would advocate for a broadening of Wassenaar to also encompass economic security considerations. Of course, nothing is impossible, but let's say I would be surprised if this is the trajectory of the discussion. I could rather imagine that among maybe first like-minded allies also within Europe, that there is a push maybe from the German government, maybe from other governments toward something else focused on economic security next to Wassenaar.
Rem, the Wassenaar arrangement was literally negotiated in the Netherlands. Is there enthusiasm there for creating something new, or rather to maintain Wassenaar as is?
Not just in the Netherlands, Emily. Actually, where I sit, or where the institute, the building of which you see behind me, is located, Wassenaar, a suburb of The Hague. So, I mean, that should be ample reason not to get rid of the Wassenaar arrangement. But on a less frivolous note, I mean, Wassenaar is important, but it's not sufficient. And it's like Wan Ho and Jan Peter said. I think the Netherlands desperately wants to develop a multilateral solution to the current predicament. I don't think it feels comfortable with, for lack of a better word, of keeping the relationship bilateralized on semiconductor export controls with the United States, because it's not naive. It knows which way the wind will blow then. At the same time, how do you develop a multilateral solution? And I think the Dutch will be very wary of any Wassenaar 2.0, which would be very broad-based, kind of like the description of the Wassenaar arrangement right now, because it would automatically be seen as an anti-Chinese tech bloc. I think Wan Ho's suggestions are more along the lines of my thinking, where you try to set up targeted multilateral or plurilateral formats to discuss particular export regimes for sectors or technologies. That might make it a little bit cumbersome, but at the same time, I think you need to do that to enable a multilateral solution to emerge, which doesn't necessarily lead to very strong anti-Chinese reflexes. Also, on the issue of whether only military technology should be covered or not, to be honest, I think we've already passed that station. There is no distinction between military and civilian tech in this sphere. I listened to European Commission President von der Leyen talk about, well, we need targeted measures only to look at military technologies. Well, show me a semiconductor technology that can or cannot be used for military ends. But I think a targeted sectoral approach is the way to go.
Jack, over to you.
Yes, I think in Taiwan it's a different story. We are not a member of the Wassenaar Arrangement, but we have established a voluntary-based export control system, including Wassenaar Arrangement as part of it. So I think, as I think other panelists has been mentioned, I think because of the advance of technology, there is a blur of the line between so-called military and commercial usage. So for how are we going to define the dual use when the technology has been evolved? For example, artificial intelligence. How are we going to if we want to control that, how are we going to do it? So I think it's a more challenging. But I think for Taiwan, we would like to play as part of a global citizen, and we welcome like-minded country to share the discussion in Wassenaar Arrangement. And then Taiwan is a major player, I think, in most of the advanced technology, especially in the ICT sector. So I think maybe Taiwan can be contributors to the future discussion of the evolving of the Wassenaar Arrangement. But I think we need to cooperate closely with the like-minded country, and we all welcome your contribution to us.
Francesca, a lot of responsibility, the final word, and representing the viewpoint of the European Union on the Wassenaar Arrangement. Any thoughts?
I think I'm going to be banned from Brussels after this webinar. So great for it. So just one short comment before I go there. I just wanted also to build on Ram's comment about how do you target technologies. It's not even just about technologies, right? When, for example, critical minerals become part of the critical technology list, then it just becomes so big and so difficult. But anyhow, I agree with most of what has been said so far. I agree that Wassenaar is currently not fit for purpose, but that is not a sufficient reason to abandon the format. But in many cases, what we're experiencing right now, and I'm going to be a little bit blunt, hopefully I'm not going to be banned from every conversation from now on, is that the US takes an initiative, of course, with some exceptions, and then other countries, including European countries, have to respond and adapt according to own interests, but they do have to respond and adapt. And that is not really a sustainable way forward for European countries. And that is why the EU and Europeans probably would like to have something more structured. But again, as both my European colleagues, Jan Peter and Ram have highlighted, a more structured proposal may not necessarily have the backing that it requires. So probably making economic security and all the policies that economic security thinking is influencing these days, that is not just export controls, as a permanent issue within a possibly G7 plus sort of format rather than just the straight G7 is probably the most viable way to have a platform where to, on a yearly basis or more, debate the economic security issues and then potentially coordinate.
Well, thank you to all of you for joining from different time zones, different perspectives. It's been a pleasure to hear from each of you. And as a reminder, our compendium is available through the Center for Strategic and International Studies at csis.org. So please do check that out, where you can find each of the chapters along with full panelist biographies. And with that, I will close today's session and thank you all again.